Juhani Pallasmaa is a great Finnish architect, and he's given us buildings from homes to concert halls whose design reflects a keen understanding of embodied experience, the embodied experience of those who encounter or those who inhabit the buildings. But he's also a great world architect, and he's shaped our evolving appreciation of new architecture in many ways, including his service on the jury for the Pritzker Prize and other juries, with his judgment forged both by his own experience as an architect and his friendship with many other great architects. But these grand qualifications are not why we have invited him to give this keynote lecture. Rather, it is for his writings and lectures which have placed architecture in relation to a deep understanding of human perception and embodied experience. His book, The Eyes of the Skin, let us think deeply about how our experience of a building goes far beyond the visual impressions that can be captured in the pages of a glossy magazine. The thinking hand meditates on the linkage between perception and action in the design as well as the experience of buildings. And the exhibition and book on animal architecture asks us to reflect on the integration of efficacy and beauty in a range of constructions by birds, insects, and other animals. But I think it's fair to say that in all of this, the actual findings of neuroscience have played at best a secondary role. However, the thoughtful consideration of action and perception, of embodiment and aesthetics, raises exactly the right sort of questions that those of us interested in neuroscience for architecture must address. Specifically, Juhani proposes that the topics of imagination and empathy are topics not only for architectural education, but also for research in the neurosciences. It is thus my pleasure and my honor to welcome Juhani Pallasmaa to our conference and ask him to share with you his ideas on empathic and embodied imagination, intuiting life and experience in architecture. Juhani.
Thank you, Michael, for a very generous introduction. Contemporary architecture has often been accused of emotional coldness, exclusive and restrictive aesthetics, and a distance from life. The criticism suggests that we architects have adapted a formalist attitude instead of aspiring to tune our buildings with realities of life. Don't we design our houses on the basis of functional and aesthetic criteria instead of imagining them as resonant settings on the basis settings and backgrounds for situations of lived life, or instead of intuiting the behavioral and mental interactions between spaces and their occupants? Let us assume a wall. What takes place behind it? The French poet Jean Tardieu asks provocatively, but do we architects have the same curiosity for life? The weakness of the sense of life in contemporary buildings may not only result from a deliberate emotive distance or formalist rejection of life's nuances and complexities, but simply geometric configurations may be easier to imagine than the shapeless and dynamic acts of life taking place in them, or the ephemeral feelings evoked by them. Joseph Brodsky makes the blunt suggestion to that effect. The city of memory is empty because for an imagination it is easier to conjure architecture than human beings. These are ideal cities in history. No doubt, modernism at large, its theory, education as well as practices, have focused more on form and aesthetic criteria than the interaction between built form and life, especially mental life. Le Corbusier's famous credo architecture is the masterly, correct, and magnificent play of masses brought together in light, turned architecture into a visually autonomous art form. Regardless of his formalist credo, I must add, Le Corbusier's architectural works project forceful emotional experiences. Here, the poet and artist, in his complex character, takes over the polemicist. Yet, architectural form is humanly meaningful only when it is experienced in resonance with life, real, remembered, or imagined. The minimalist style of the past decades has tended to distance architecture even further from events of life. Again, I need to add that I believe in the value of reduction myself. I characterize myself or my work as sensuous minimalism. When expressing my criticality of contemporary architecture, I want to emphasize firmly that I do not support any nostalgic, Heimlich, or regressive architecture. In fact, our conservative consumer culture everywhere is primarily offering such alternatives. I am calling for an architectural thinking that incorporates life in all its practical and mental implications beyond the Vitruvian trinity of utilitas, firmitas, venustas. The reductive attitude to life denies its essential spontaneity and messiness and tends to turn life itself into a formal and predictable behavior. Yet, as John Ruskin concludes, imperfection is in some way essential to all that we know of life. It is a sign of life in a mortal body, that is to say, of a state of process of change. Nothing that lives is or can be rigidly perfect. Part of it is decaying, part nascent, and in all things that live, there are certain irregularities and deficiencies which are not only signs of life, but sources of beauty. This is John Ruskin. As I began my studies in architecture at the Helsinki University of Technology in the late 1950s, Professor Aulis Blomstedt, who was the counterpart of Alvar Aalto in the Finnish post-war architectural ideology, used to teach us the talent of imagining human situations is more important for an architect than the gift of fantasizing spaces. The conscious interest of architects already in those years was directed to formal, visual, and compositional qualities of design, and I did not quite grasp the meaning of my professor's statement. Through my own design work and studies in the philosophical essence of architecture during the subsequent 5 decades, I have gradually learned to appreciate the significance of this view. Qualities of physical space, our behavior, and mental tuning are interrelated, and when designing physical spaces, we are also designing or implicitly specifying distinct experiences, emotions, and mental states. Architectural spaces are not just lifeless frames for our activities. They guide, choreograph, and stimulate actions, interests, and moods, or in the negative case, they stifle them. For me, the scene last night at sunset on the courtyard was one of the most powerful architectural experiences I have ever had. It's just an astonishing example of what architecture can do to connect us with, the greater powers of the universe. Even more importantly, they give our experiences of being specific perceptual frames and horizons of understanding. This is exactly what happened last night. Every space, place, and situation is tuned in a specific way, and they project atmospheres promoting distinct moods and feelings. We live in a resonance with our world, and architecture mediates and maintains that very resonance. Buildings are products of imagination. Every human structure has first existed as an intentional mental image. Isn't it depressing to realize that all the ugliness in our surroundings is a consequence of human thought? In my view, there are 2 qualitative levels of imagination. One that projects formal and geometric images, and another one that also simulates the actual sensory, emotive, and mental encounter with this projected reality. The first category of imagination projects the material object in isolation. The second as a lived and experienced reality in our life world. In the first case, the imaginatively projected object remains as an external image outside of the experiencing and sensing self, whereas in the latter case, it becomes part of his/her existential experience, as in the real encounter with material reality. The neurological affinity between what is perceived and what is imagined has been well established in scientific studies, so I will not say more about this issue. The formal imagination is primarily engaged with topological and geometric facts, whereas the emphatic imagination evokes embodied and emotive experiences, qualities, and moods. Maurice Merleau-Ponty introduced the evocative notion of the flesh of the world to denote the lived reality in which we inseparably dwell, and the emphatic imagination evokes multisensory, integrated, and lived experiences of this very flesh. Henry Moore, the master sculptor, gives a vivid description of the simultaneous embodied internalization and imaginative externalizing power of artistic imagination. This is what the sculptor must do. He must strive continually to think of and use form in its full spatial completeness. He gets the solid, as it were, the solid shape, as it were, inside his head. He thinks of it, whatever its size, as if holding it completely enclosed in the hollow of his hand. He mentally visualizes a complex form from all round itself, knows while he looks at one side what the other side is like. He identifies himself with its center of gravity, its mass, its weight. He realizes its volume and the space that the shape displaces in the air. This precise account of a great artist suggests that the act of imagining spaces and objects is not solely a visual endeavor. It is a process of embodiment, identification, and feeling the entire entity as an imaginary extension of one's self through embodied simulation. The artist's body becomes the work, and simultaneously the work becomes an extension of the artist's body. Every creative person works unconsciously with herself as much as with material, form, sounds, or words. Einstein's famous confession of his visual and muscular thinking in a letter to the French mathematician Jacques Hadamard is an authoritative suggestion that all thinking has a component of embodiment. Imagination is not a quasi-visual projection. We imagine through our entire embodied existence. Thinking is actually a way of molding one's world as if it were a sculptor's clay. Heidegger compared thinking with cabinet making. Yet, Henry Moore adds a crucial comment on the role of the conscious intellect. The artist works with a concentration of his whole personality, and the conscious part of it resolves conflicts, organizes memories, and prevents him from trying to walk in two directions at the same time. The intellect provides the ground and control for the process, but the poetic image does not arise from reason alone. In his illuminating essay entitled Trout and the Mountain Stream, Alvarado valorizes his creative process and particularly the factors beyond rational consciousness. The cause of the frustration, typical in design work, I believe, is is the complicated and intense pressure of the fact that architectural design operates with innumerable elements and that internally stand in opposition to each other. All this becomes a maze that cannot be sorted out in rational and mechanical manner. The large number of different demands and subproblems form an obstacle that is difficult for the architectural concept to break through. In such cases, I work sometimes totally on instinct in the following way. For a moment, I forget all the maze of problems after I have developed a feel for the program and its innumerable demands have been engraved in my subconscious. I begin to draw in a manner rather like that of abstract art. Led only by my instinct, I draw not architectural syntheses, but sometimes even childish compositions, and via this route, I eventually arrive at an abstract basis to the main concept, a kind of universal substance, with whose help the numerous quarreling subproblems can be brought into harmony. I find the notion of Aalto's notion of a universal substance very thought-provoking, as it seems to refer to a general atmosphere or tuning of the work rather than any specific or concrete ideas. I wish to argue firmly that true qualities of architecture are not formal or geometric, intellectual, or even aesthetic. They are existential and poetic, embodied and emotive experiences which connect us with the deep historicity of dwelling, and they arise from our existential encounters with the world rather than the sense of vision. Artistic images are not pure formal configurations. They are images that are embedded in the soil of human historicity, memory, and imagination. Poetic images are always new and ancient at the same time. Like the Jungian archetypes, architectural images evoke recollections, feelings, and associations. Existentially meaningful architectural images evoke feelings, recollections, and associations. They cannot, meaningful architectural images cannot be mere formal fabrications or inventions, as they are bound to echo our mental world, and artistic experiences are thus essentially exchanges. We experience them as part of our life world and give them their meanings. This is a point I really want to emphasize, that artistic forms cannot be fabricated. Architectural qualities are constituted in experiencing the work, as philosopher John Dewey argued of works of art in general in Art as Experience, where he writes, by common consent, the Parthenon is a great work of art, yet it has aesthetic standing only as the work becomes an experience for a human being. Art is always the product in experience of an interaction of human beings with their environments, the philosopher argues. Formal structures and qualities of architecture have their significance in the perceptual process, but they are rationalizing scaffoldings for the experiential and sensory encounter. It needs to be pointed out that even unbuilt projects and architectural propositions, from the mind-blowing spaces of Giovanni Battista Piranesi to the micromegas of Daniel Libeskind, can well be imaginatively projected in the flesh of the world, just as any other artistic works. The artistic value of such works is that they are experientially and emotively real. Artistic works are not symbols or metaphors of something else. They are an authentic experiential reality themselves. All art, in fact, exists simultaneously in two realms, that of physical matter and execution on one hand, and that of mental imagery on the other. A painting is paint on canvas, but at the same time it is an image and narrative in the imaginative mental realm. Sculpture is similarly a piece of stone or wood and a mental image. A building, likewise, a utilitarian structure and a mental suggestion, a spatial metaphor of human existence. That's what, in my view, architecture essentially is. It is a spatial metaphor, a three-dimensional mandala, as it were. This dual essence and double focus is fundamental to the mental impact of art. Experiencing an artistic image seems to create a momentary short circuit between our cognitive and emotive orientations. We do not usually recognize that we actually dwell in architectural metaphors, poeticized images, which provide specific frames and horizons for experiencing and understanding our life situation. Besides, works of art and architecture alter our perception of the world. We come not to see the work of art, but the world according to the work. For me, this has become a very essential ethical point when thinking about the task of architecture. As Alvar Aalto testified earlier, architectural ideas are not usually born as clear and final forms. They arise as diffuse images, often as formless bodily feelings. They are eventually developed and concretized in successive sketches and models, refined and specified in working drawings, turned into material existence through numerous hands and machines, and finally experienced as purposeful utilitarian structures in the context of life. Yet, even the art of poetry is engaged with the material world and the body. Poet Charles Tomlinson points out, painting awakes up the hand, draws in your sense of muscular coordination, your sense of the body, if you like. Poetry also, as it pivots on its stresses, as it rides forward over the line endings, or comes to rest at pauses in the line, poetry also brings the whole man into play and his bodily sense of himself. The British painter and essayist Adrian Stokes makes the ultimate argument in a way all art originates in the body. What I have said so far raises the essential question: how can architectural ideas and aspirations, particularly emotive qualities, emerging initially as immaterial feelings of the designer in the design process, be translated and transferred into the actual building and finally to the person experiencing it? And how can such vague and weakly formalized feelings be communicated? It seems crucial that the designer masters the entire process in order to mediate and materialize her intentions. A talented architect also constructs the entire edifice in her imagination. Every great building has been built twice, first in the immaterial realm of imagination, and then in the material world under laws of physics. Every profound building has been imaginatively inhabited by the designer. I develop around a dozen alternatives for each project of mine before I arrive at an acceptable one. So during the course of developing a house, I inhabit a dozen imaginary houses, one after the other, and turn away from each one of them. Paul Valéry, the great French poet, points out poetically the extreme subtlety required of the architect in transmitting experiential intentions. Quote, "He gave a like care to all the sensitive points of the building. You would have thought that it was his own body that he was tending. But all these delicate devices were as nothing compared to those which he employed when he elaborated the emotions and vibrations of the soul of the future beholder of his work." This is Phaedrus describing the care by which Eupalinos, the architect in the poet's dialogue entitled Eupalinos, or the architect, proceeded in his design process. "My temple must move men as they are moved by the beloved," the poet adds. I wish to add, in passing, that here there is a distinct sensual and erotic quality in all meaningful spatial and architectural experiences, as they are essentially sensuous embraces. And an architectural space is simultaneously the mother's and the lover's embrace. It is usually understood that a sensitive designer imagines the acts, experiences, and feelings of the user of the space. But I do not believe human empathic imagination works that way. The designer places herself in the role of the future dweller and tests the validity of the ideas through his imaginative exchange of roles and personalities. Thus, the architect is bound to conceive a design essentially for himself as the momentary surrogate of the actual occupant. Without usually being aware of it, the designer turns into a silent actor on the imaginary stage of the project. In the end of the design process, the architect offers the building to the user as a gift. It is a gift also in the sense that the designer has given birth to the other's home as a surrogate mother gives birth to the child of a woman who is not biologically capable of doing it herself. In unspecialized indigenous cultures, everyone was capable of giving this architectural birth by building one's own dwelling. And all animals can still do it. As buildings are extensions of our bodily and mental faculties, the metaphor of giving birth has even an extended meaning. Profound architecture is a gift in yet another sense. It transcends its given conditions and conscious intentions. A creative work is always more than could be rationally deducted or foreseen, otherwise it would not qualify as a creative act. What we saw last night in this cosmic theater is something nobody could have prescribed. It's a miracle, it's a gift. The idea of projecting one's self in the process of emphatic imagination evokes another crucial question. How does the mental projection take place in collective work, such as teamwork in a large design office? In fact, all architectural projects today are bound to be some kind of collaboration. In my view, it requires the sensitivity and focused identity of a well-rehearsed musical ensemble to succeed in the demanding and seemingly impossible task of collective imagination. And it also requires a shared atmosphere and a charismatic conductor. However, teamwork rarely achieves the intensity and integrity of a work conceived by a single creator. Group work tends to strengthen the rational, stylistic, and conscious aspects of design as a result of the need for communication. Isn't it impossible to think how a deeply emotive and subconscious work, such as Alvar Aalto's Villa Mairea or Säynätsalo Town Hall, Le Corbusier's Ronsard, Sigurd Leverent's late churches, Luis Barragan's chapel in Mexico City, or the work we are next to right now, how these could arise from teamwork. In my view, they have to be a result of a singular emotive, synthesizing, and empathic imagination. These ideas have evidently been incubated in a singular personality. The design process is a vague and emotive process alternating between internalization and projection, thinking and feeling, embodiment and conceptualization, association and rejection, trial and error, which eventually becomes increasingly concrete and precise. The projected reality is internalized or introjected. Here I'm using the psychoanalytic term for the way that a child internalizes the world through her mouth. And the self is simultaneously projected out into the space. A gifted architect feels and imagines the building, its countless relationships and details as if it were part of an extension of his, her own self and body, as Valéry and Henry Moore suggested earlier. The geometric and formal properties in architecture can usually be rather precisely identified and imagined through formal imagination, especially by means of using projective technical aids such as axonometric and perspectival constructions, physical models, or computer drawings and simulations. The lived characteristics, the building as a setting for activities and interactions, call for a multisensory and empathic imagination. Significantly, the designer does not project the building into his, her current reality of life. He imagines the reality of the building and places himself there. The fact that computer renderings usually appeal lifeless and emotionless arises from the fact that the process itself does not contain emotive and emphatic component. It is a result of cold projective mechanics in mathematicized space. The most ephemeral and complex of these subconscious mental simulations is the simultaneous grasping of the entire ambience, atmosphere, or mood of a space or place. As Peter Zumthor reports, I enter a building, see a room, and in the fraction of a second have this feeling about it. Zumthor is here referring to the experience of the mood in a materially existing rooms. Yet a talented designer, as Zumthor himself, is equally capable of entering an imaginary room and sensing the atmosphere and tunedness of this physically non-existent space. This imagination of atmosphere is probably the most demanding task of imagination because it is not an object at all, but something suspended between the setting and the subject. It is similar to the composer's skill in imagining an entire musical work or the writer's task of imagining the characters, spaces, and events of a complex, complete novel and creating the continuous and dynamic literary score for the dynamic continuum of the atmosphere. In a couple of my writings, I have named our atmospheric perception our sixth sense, and in my view, it could well be the most synthetic and most important of our senses. Permit me to return back to the motto of my lecture by the Dutch filmmaker. Literature, theater, and film hardly exist without images and narratives of life. They are epic art forms, while architecture has regrettably lost its epic dimension. Why do the architectural images that we build for ourselves to dwell in so often exclude a narrative of life, while a simple photograph of Farmer's Kitchen on the left by Walker Evans, or a Shaker interior, radiates a dignity of simple life? In my way of teaching architecture, literature, cinema, and painting have a central role exactly for the purpose of bringing images of life back to architectural thinking. We architects can learn empathic imagination and atmosphere, especially through literature. In her book, Dreaming by the Book, the literary scholar Elaine Scarry deliberates upon the question how a writer's text can evoke vivid images and feelings in the reader's mind, and she assumes that imaginary vivacity comes about by reproducing the deep structure of perception. In his book, The Hidden Order of Art, Anton Ehrenzweig argues that the unconscious, diffuse, and peripheral ingredients actually make a work of a piece of art. The notion of deep structure suggests the engagement of the unconscious and collective primal layers of memory and mind. At the same time that a powerful literary image projects an imaginary world, say in the opening words of Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis, when Gregor Samsa woke one morning from troubled dreams, he found himself transformed right there in his bed into some sort of monstrous insect. This single sentence drills deep into the reader's subconscious and creates the ambience of the book. The magic of the writer's words is so powerful that during my several visits in St. Petersburg through several decades, I have always kept imagining the streets and places of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment instead of seeing the current real spaces of the city. The great novel controls my sense of reality. Scarry explains her idea of vividness further. In order to achieve the vivacity of the material world, the verbal arts must somehow also imitate its persistence and, most crucially, its quality of givenness. It seems almost certainly the case that it is the instructional character of the verbal arts that fulfills this mimetic requirement for givenness. In my view, similar imaginative vivacity is also required of the architect's mental process. In her creative imagination, simply the ideas and forms have to be set convincingly in the flesh of the world. As Konstantin Brancusi demands, art must give suddenly all at once the shock of life, the sensation of breathing. That's the most direct advice to students of art that I can think of. And the architectural entity must be similarly existentially credible, which is not often the case with today's formalist architectural fabrications. Reality is not always plausible. Reality is not always possible or likely, Jorge Luis Borges states, but if you are writing a story, you have to make it as plausible as you can, because otherwise the reader's imagination will reject it. The same requirement of plausibility applies in architecture. Otherwise, the occupant's imagination will reject the work as a mere formal fabrication, devoid of a convincing existential foothold. Architecture derives its authority from a sense of reality, not from fantasy. And I come to my last chapter, syncretic imagination. An extraordinary imaginative capacity is revealed by Mozart, describing the feeling of gradual disintegration of temporal succession in his creative process. I spread it, he means the composition, out broader and clearer, and at last it gets almost finished in my head, even when it is a long piece, so that I can see the whole of it at a single glance in my mind, as if it were a beautiful painting or a handsome human being. In which way I do not hear it in my imagination at all as a succession. That way it must come later, but all at once, as it were. The best of all is the hearing of it all at once. Just think of Mozart's Requiem, hearing it all at once. Fantastic. No doubt, a building can also be similarly sensed all at once, as a singular sensation, as a singular being, a kind of universal substance, by a genius of spatial imagination. I have no doubt that Louis Kahn imagined the Salk Institute as a singular experience. It is not surprising that musical and spatial intelligences have been suggested among the dozen categories of human intelligence beyond the intelligence measured by the standard IQ test. Yet another quality of our perceptual and emotive system was evoked by Heinrich Wölfflin in his dissertation in 1886, when he asks, how is it possible that architectural forms are able to invoke an emotion or a mood? Yes. How does Michelangelo's architecture and sculpture evoke such deep feelings of melancholy, and Mozart's music so delightfully energetic and optimistic moods? Michelangelo himself argued that everything in art and architecture arises from the human body. And indeed, his buildings and sculptures are bodies and muscles of marble that have fallen in deep and poetic melancholia. Michelangelo's every volume, structural member, line and profile seems to be alive, like the muscles and tendons of a human body in tension. I'll stop here not to take more time than was given to me. Thank you.
Let's see, we're right on time, and if Juhani is prepared to take some questions, I think we could entertain a couple, if you're willing to do that. Sure. Any questions from the audience? The microphone runners, do we have microphone runners?
Hello. Yeah. Thank you, Juhani. It's a very inspiring lecture to start with. I'm going to try to ask you a question that is a difficult question, but after that lecture, I think you could take this question. So here you have all this advice, which most of us here in the audience, architects and others, believe profoundly. The question confronting us really here is the connection between phenomenology and science. How science could begin to tell us about in third person, I guess, this first person experience is the one you're talking about. What would be the best way that, given this larger perspective you're providing us, how could you advise using neuroscience or using other means by which we could advance the cause that you so well spoke about?
Well, my point here, our message contains a implied criticism towards too much, how would I say, rationalizing attitude towards the artistic phenomena, and also towards believing that we can approach these things through developing mechanical things to help us. My message is that we have fantastic capacities in ourselves. We are instruments that natural evolution has developed through hundreds of millions of years. We should focus our attention into rediscovering and respecting that enormous evolutionary course that the human body and human mind have passed through, and refine the talents that we have in us. I'm afraid that much of this today's interest tends to, at least implies a disservice by making us forget the capacities we have in ourselves. I don't know whether I answered your question, but this is what I sincerely feel. I'm not against anything that has been spoken here or probably will be spoken here. I would just wish to really strongly support a biologically oriented view of human life and the human being. We are animals of nature. Our bodies still remember. We all have the tailbone from the phase we were climbing up in trees. This pink triangle in our eyes here, the plica semilunaris, that's the point at which the horizontally moving eyelid was fixed when we were lizards. We still show that we have been lizards right in our face. So why should we forget the biological origins of our mental life?
I think that's, excuse me, I think that's an excellent point to end on. We are biological organisms, and we should not forget that, but at the same time, we should try to understand what that means.
Yes,
and that's exactly what what ANFA poses to do, and that's why we're all here together. So I think at this point, because we have 25 minutes before the next session starts, this would be a good time to take a coffee break. The coffee is outside, and we'll come back at 10:15 to begin the wayfinding session.